When we go through a time like the present with so many people dying in hospital of COVID or suffering from the disease or fearful of catching it, it's natural to ask the question, well, if God is real and God is good, why does he allow something like this to happen? How can you believe in a God who allows this to happen in his world? Now, of course, philosophers and theologians have thought for years, for centuries, about the problem of evil. And they've come up with all kinds of different answers. Maybe God built it into the system because somehow suffering is good for us. Maybe it's our fault because of the misuse of human free will. Maybe it's the devil's fault. There's a power at work in the world that is opposed to God and his purposes. But none of these answers really satisfy. They may have some point to them, but at the end of the day, they're never really satisfying, especially when you're going through a time of suffering yourself. Now, the reality is that I've never yet met a Christian who can come up with a nice, neat, satisfying answer to the problem of suffering, and yet they believe anyway. Now, it's not that they haven't thought about it. Christians have thought deeply, and I know many who have thought deeply at a philosophical level about the problem of suffering. Can't come up with a nice, neat answer, but still believe. Again, it's not that they don't experience suffering. I know Christians who've been through profound experiences of suffering, and yet still somehow they believe. Now, why do they do that? And how do they do that? Well, let me say some of the things that Christians believe about suffering. First is that suffering is real and that it stinks. There are some religions, philosophies that would suggest that suffering is somehow an illusion and we can overcome it by an exercise of the mind. But Christian faith says no. Suffering is real. What happens in COVID wards is real. When people are struggling for breath, that is real. It's painful, it's horrible, and it needs to be opposed with everything that we have. But secondly, it tells us that not just we oppose suffering, but God opposes it too. Because this was never part of the plan. The world that God made was a good world, and yet something has entered into that world, which means that now this world is broken. It's not the way it was originally designed to be. That this world doesn't work the way it should do. It's a bit like a virus that enters into a computer. If you've ever had a virus in your laptop or your computer at home, you'll kind of know that it doesn't quite work properly. Some bits work, some bits don't. And that's kind of like the world that we experience. Yes, we experience the goodness, the beauty of the world, and yet the world doesn't quite work the way it should, and we see all kinds of ugly suffering within it. But then, most importantly, Christians believe that God does not just look at this world from a distance, wringing his hands and saying how terrible it is, but he has entered into this dark world himself. That in the person of Jesus Christ, God the Creator entered into this world and lived in this world, not in a pampered, privileged way, immune from suffering at all. But he went through all the experiences that we do of pain, of hunger and difficulty, even into death itself, and in fact the worst kind of death, dying on a cross, so that we can know that God stands with us when we go through that. He knows what it's like to feel lonely. He knows what it's like to feel abandoned. He knows what it's like to feel pain. He knows what it's like to struggle for breath. So that if we go into the COVID ward, we can know that God is there with us. But even more than that, the story tells us that this God doesn't just enter into our world to stand with us, but actually overcomes suffering and death. Because at the heart of Christian faith is this belief that Jesus Christ enters into death like a hero entering the stronghold of the enemy, and yet fights the enemy and defeats it. And in the resurrection, this wonderful thing that we celebrate at Easter every year, he breaks through death and comes out the other side, breaks the power of death, and shows us that life is beyond death itself. Now, we get signs of that in our world. The scientists who have come up with the vaccine are absolutely doing the will of God. They're using their God-given powers to enable suffering to be overcome as a little sign, perhaps, of that great victory that God won that day of resurrection. Now, that is, I think, why Christians believe. Because at the end of the day, you can decide if you want to that you don't want to believe in God. You can delete God if you like. But my question is, if you delete God, if you don't believe in him, have you solved the problem of suffering? Of course, the answer is you haven't. You've still got to suffer. You've still got to enter the COVID ward. You've still got to somehow find a way through that. What you have done is taken away any possibility that it might ever change, or the idea that somehow evil is a stranger in this world and that ultimately one day it will be banished forever, because that's what Christian faith says. The resurrection didn't just happen to Jesus on that third day. It's a sign of what will one day happen to the whole of the world. That evil is a stranger here. Suffering doesn't belong. One day it will be banished. The reason Christians believe is not because we have a nice, neat answer to the problem of suffering, but it's because when you suffer, you need hope. And that in Jesus Christ, we find hope that gives us something to hold on to, something to look forward to, a hope that is true for this life and even beyond this life into the next.